In the spring of 2011, a soil specialist named Glenn Dorsey stood on a windy hilltop in Macon County, North Carolina, pressed a steel probe into the ground, read the dial, and told a 26-year-old woman that her family had been farming the wrong half of their land for 100 years. He was a kind man, and he said it kindly. He said the hilltop was thin, that the good dirt had washed down into the bottoms generations ago. That whatever she thought she remembered growing up, there was a child's memory and not a yield. He called the place a hobby plot. Then he wrote a number on his clipboard, 4 inches of topsoil where the valley had 30, and he drove his clean white truck back down the gravel toward the county road. 11 years later, in the autumn of 2022, a senior buyer for one of the oldest tea houses in the country sat at a long table in Asheville, tasted a cup brewed from leaves grown on that exact thin hilltop, set the cup down, and offered a price per pound that nobody in that room had ever heard, quoted for tea grown on American soil. $480. Between those two moments lies the whole story, 11 years of one woman and one stubborn slope and a grandmother's notebook. And I want to tell you how the worst ground on the farm came to grow the most valuable thing the family ever sold. Stay with me, because the part that matters is not the number. The part that matters is why the number was possible at all. The woman's name was May Tran. Her grandmother had carried a handful of seeds across an ocean in a tin box in 1952, and May had spent her childhood on that hilltop and most of her 20s trying to leave it. Let me tell you about the hilltop first, because everything turns on it. The Tran place sat on 400 acres of mountain ground folded into the southern Appalachians, and most of it was exactly what Glenn Dorsey said it was. The bottoms were rich, black, deep, the kind of soil a man could grow corn in without thinking. The slopes were stony and acid and steep, and the very top of the highest rise, 4.5 acres of it, was the thinnest, sourest ground on the whole farm. Rain ran off it. Wind scoured it. The county map marked it as marginal, unsuited to row crops, and the family had treated it as a place to let goats wander for as long as anyone could remember. Yet on that hilltop, in long crooked rows that followed no plan a modern eye could read, grew several hundred tea bushes that May's grandmother had planted by hand over 40 years. And those bushes were the reason the family was still on the land at all, though almost nobody in the county understood that, yet, least of all May's own mother. Her mother was named Rose, and Rose was the one who said the words that became the spine of everything. Rose had grown up on that hilltop watching her own mother fuss over the bushes, and Rose had concluded early that the fussing was grief dressed up as farming, an old woman's way of keeping her dead country alive in a row of plants that would never pay a bill. When May came home in 2011, 26 and freshly quit from a marketing job in Atlanta, she had hated with a completeness that frightened her. Rose met her at the door with a dish towel in her hand and a warning in her voice. "The soil up there is too thin," Rose said. "It was too thin for my mother, and it will be too thin for you. Plant corn in the bottoms like Hal Pruitt, or get a real job, but do not waste your good years on a dead woman's hobby." May did not answer her. She walked up the hill in her city shoes, and she stood in the wind among the bushes her grandmother had planted, and she did the one thing her grandmother had taught her to do before anything else. She picked a single leaf, folded it, and pressed it to her nose. Glenn Dorsey came 3 weeks later because May had called the extension office in good faith, the way a sensible person checks a thing before betting 11 years on it. He was sincere. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story makes him a fool. And he was not a fool. He had a master's degree in soil science from a good university. He had spent 20 years helping farmers in those mountains, keep their families fed, and he was, by every measure his profession recognized, right. He measured the topsoil and found 4 inches. He measured the slope and found it too steep for equipment. He pulled the organic matter numbers and the pH and the cation exchange capacity, which is the dirt's ability to hold the nutrients a plant needs. And every reading told the same story, that this was poor ground for growing anything a market would pay for. He looked at the tea bushes, and he saw a sentimental anomaly. A hobby plot, he called it, standing in the wind with his clipboard. You could grow these for yourself, he told her, but you will never make a living off 4 acres of thin dirt on a hilltop. The market wants volume, and you cannot get volume here. He was not wrong about the volume. He was wrong about what the ground was for. Let me tell you what her grandmother knew that Glenn Dorsey did not, because this is the whole mechanism, and the reason the reveal lands the way it does. The thing that makes tea worth drinking, the aroma and the depth and the complexity that buyers pay for, comes from compounds the plant makes when it is mildly stressed. A tea bush living in deep, rich, well-watered soil grows fast and lush and makes big, bland leaves with thin flavor because it has no reason to defend itself. A tea bush living on thin, stony, acid ground, scoured by wind and forced to send its roots deep to find water, grows slowly and makes small leaves dense with the very compounds that thin soil and slow growth produce, the polyphenols and the aromatic oils, the amino acid called theanine that gives fine tea its sweetness and body. The Chinese growers who had perfected this craft over 1,000 years had a saying about it, that the best tea grows where nothing else will. The famous mountain teas of her grandmother's home province came from exactly this kind of ground, high and thin and difficult, where a corn farmer would have starved. What Glenn Dorsey read as the worst soil on the farm was, for this one particular plant, very close to the best soil in the state. The hilltop was not a flaw the family had failed to fix for 100 years. It was the asset, and only one person alive understood it, and she had crossed an ocean with it in a tin box. And she had been dead for 6 years. May found the notebook that first winter in a cedar chest in the room that had been her grandmother's. It was a thick journal bound in cracked black cloth, and it was written half in a careful spidery English and half in characters May could not read, and it was the single most valuable object on 400 acres. Though it would have brought nothing at auction, her grandmother had recorded 40 years of observation on that hilltop in it. Which bushes leafed first in a cold spring. How the flavor of the April flush differed from the flush after the first summer drought. The exact morning temperature at which she picked. How long she let the leaves wither on bamboo trays in the barn loft before she fired them. And at what heat, and for how long, and how the smell changed at each stage so she would know by her nose alone when to stop. Salt, the old woman had written in one margin, in English, was the enemy of the leaf, and patience was its friend. And the hilltop gave both in the right measure. May sat with that notebook through January and February, and somewhere in those cold months, she stopped being a woman who had come home to fail, quietly, and became a woman who had come home to learn something nobody around her believed was real. If you have ever had someone you love tell you that the thing you care about is a waste of your good years, you already understand the weather. May lived inside that first year. And I would be glad to know in a comment whether the people around you turned out right or wrong in the end. Rose was not cruel. Rose was frightened. The specific fear of a woman who had watched her own mother pour a life into a hillside and die with nothing in the bank to show for it, and Rose did not want to watch her daughter do the same. So Rose pushed. She pointed at Hal Pruitt down in the valley, who that same spring had taken out a loan and put 200 acres of bottomland into corn and bought a new sprayer to do it. There is a man who understands ground, Rose said. He plants where the dirt is good, and he sells what the market wants. Hall Pruitt was not a villain either. He was a decent neighbor doing exactly what every credentialed voice in the county told him to do. Planting the rich bottoms in the crop that paid, financing the equipment that made it efficient, scaling up the way the extension bulletins and the bank both recommended. For the first few years, it looked like wisdom, and May's slow work on the hilltop looked like exactly the foolishness Rose feared, because May's work was slow in a way that is hard to convey to anyone who has not done it. A tea bush does not pay you the year you tend it. It does not pay you the second year either. She spent 2011 and 2012 simply learning to read her grandmother's notebook against the actual bushes, walking the rows at dawn before the dew burned off, pressing leaves to her nose, comparing what she smelled against the spidery English in the margins. The notebook said, "The bushes in the third row, from the east, leafed a week ahead of the rest because the rise sheltered them from the worst of the wind." And May stood in that third row, one cold April morning, and found it true, the new growth already showing, while the western rows were still tight and dormant. She ruined batch after batch in the barn loft as she taught herself the withering and the firing by feel. One whole spring flush went to waste because she fired it too hot and turned a tray of fine leaf into something bitter and scorched that no amount of patience could recover. The plants her grandmother had let go, half-wild needed pruning back to productivity, and a pruned tea bush sulks for 2 seasons before it rewards you. So that even her successes were invisible, buried in a future she had to take on faith. She had a little money saved from the Atlanta years, and she watched it drain, $100 at a time on lab fees and propane, and the small, endless costs of a thing that earned nothing. She had a dog by then, a rough brown shepherd mix named Pip, who had wandered up the gravel one evening, eaten a bowl of scraps on the porch, and simply stayed the way the best things sometimes do. On the worst nights, when a whole tray of leaves had scorched and the smell of it filled the barn like a verdict, May would sit on the loft steps with her hand on Pip's head and read the notebook by lantern light until she believed in it again. Pip went up the hill with her every morning, ranging ahead through the rows, flushing rabbits, lying in the cool dirt at the end of a row while she worked. He was, for a long stretch of years, the only one who did. The first turn came not from the market, but from the man who had dismissed her, and it came the way real turns come, slowly and against his will. Glenn Dorsey kept driving by. The hilltop was visible from the county road, and an honest scientist is a curious animal, and Dorsey could not quite stop looking at 4 acres that refused to behave the way his instruments said they should. He stopped once in the summer of 2013 to tell May, gently, that she was throwing good years after a sentimental idea, and that was the second time he said it, standing at her barn door with his hat in his hand, more sorry than scornful. "You are a smart young woman," he said, "and I would hate to see you stay too long on a hobby that cannot carry you." That same day, though, he did something a lesser man would not have. He asked, almost against himself, what the readings were on the bushes themselves, the leaf chemistry, not just the dirt. May did not have those readings. The question lodged in her anyway, and she began to save toward a lab analysis of her leaf. And that question, asked by a sincere man who could not let a contradiction alone, was the first crack in 11 years of certainty. The next person to doubt their own doubt was harder to win, because she lived in the same house and had 40 years of certainty to undo. Rose watched her daughter go up the hill every dawn for 3 years, in summer heat and winter rain, and watched the savings dwindle to almost nothing. and waited for the day May would come down defeated and admit that her grandmother had been right, and the soil was too thin. That day did not come. Instead, Rose watched the bushes that had been pruned hard begin, in the fourth year, to come back denser and darker green and heavier, with new growth than Rose had ever seen them in her life. The rose on the thin hilltop, greener than the corn in the rich bottoms. Rose said nothing about that. She was a woman who had built her whole understanding of the world on the idea that the hilltop was a place of loss, and the evidence of her own eyes was asking her to take that understanding apart, and she was not ready. Then, one April morning in 2014, May came down from the hill with the first flush of the season in a basket. The small, bright new leaves her grandmother's notebook said were the finest of the year, and she withered them and fired them exactly as the old woman had written. And she brewed a pot in the farmhouse kitchen and set a cup in front of her mother without a word. Rose drank it. May watched her mother's face do something complicated. Rose had grown up smelling that hillside and had spent 40 years insisting it meant nothing. And now here was the smell of it, in a cup, the specific high sweetness of the mountain her own mother had tried to keep alive. And Rose set the cup down with a hand that was not quite steady and said, "That is my mother's tea." It was not surrender. Even so, it was the first time Rose had called the hilltop anything other than thin. Let me tell you what was happening to the leaf in the barn loft, because the craft was half the value, and the notebook taught it stroke by stroke. A fresh tea leaf is full of water and full of enzymes, the little biological machines that drive the changes in any living tissue. And the moment the leaf is picked from the bush, it begins to change whether you want it to or not. The whole art of making tea is the art of controlling that change. The first step is withering, which simply means letting the leaf lose moisture slowly on the trays. Hours of it, sometimes a full day, until the leaf goes limp and soft, and its chemistry begins to concentrate and turn. Wither too little, and the tea comes out grassy and sharp, all green and no depth. Wither too long, and it goes flat and stale. The life gone out of it, the window is narrow, and it moves with the weather, with the humidity and the temperature of the day. So there is no fixed rule, only attention. Her grandmother had written that the hilltop wind, the same wind Glenn Dorsey had counted on his clipboard as a liability, was the great gift of the place inside the loft, because it carried the moisture off the leaves at a slow and even rate no machine could match. A natural withering breeze that a flatland barn would never have. After the wither came the firing, the heating that stops the enzymes and locks the flavor in place at exactly the point the maker chooses. And the firing was all timing and smell, and the steady dry heat of the old wood stove her grandmother had set up in the loft 60 years before. Too cool and the leaf stews, too hot and it scorches, and you lose the whole batch, as May had lost so many. May learned to know by the changing smell, the leaf moving from grassy to floral to a deep warm note like baked stone fruit, the exact moment to pull it from the heat and spread it to cool. There was no dial for it. There was no number on a gauge that could tell her. There was only the nose and the notebook, and 4 years of ruined batches teaching her hands what the words on the page had been trying to say all along, which was that the craft could be written down, but it could not be transferred any way except through the doing of it. By 2015, May had something her grandmother had never quite achieved, which was consistency. She could make the same fine tea twice, and then a third time. The smell coming off the loft trays, the same warm note of baked stone fruit each spring. And here is where the parallel ledger of the valley begins to matter. Because while May was learning to make 2 pounds of something extraordinary, Hal Pruitt was getting very good at making a great deal of something ordinary. His corn came in heavy those years, 170 bushels to the acre on the best bottomland. And the heaviness was the trap, because it told him the path was sound. He expanded. He leased another 120 acres of bottom ground from a widow 2 farms over, and he traded the old sprayer for a new self-propelled rig that cost him north of $300,000 and could cover the whole operation in a day. He took on more debt against the strength of the harvests, and every banker and every extension bulletin told him he was doing it right. The bank loved him. The extension office, Glenn Dorsey's own office, held him up at meetings as the model of a modern operation, the kind of efficient, scaled, well-financed farm the county ought to want more of. At the sale, corn was corn, priced by the bushel against every other bushel grown anywhere on the continent. And Hal's margin lived and died on volume and on the price of diesel and seed and chemical, all of which he bought on credit against a crop that did not yet exist. To the bank, it was a thriving operation. To Hal, it was a treadmill that had to keep speeding up just to stay even. Each year's debt requiring the next year's yield, the whole thing leaning forward over a drop he could not see. He had built a beautiful, efficient machine, and a machine like that has one hidden quality that nobody sees until the day it is tested. It has no slack. It is tuned to one set of conditions, fed and watered, and financed on the assumption that the conditions will hold, and it has no answer at all for the year they do not. The third dismissal, the last one before everything changed, came at a county growers meeting in the early spring of 2016. May had finally gotten her leaf analysis back from the state lab, and the numbers on the polyphenols and the theanine were so high that the technician had called to ask if the sample had been concentrated. It had not. It was simply what the thin Hilltop did to the plant. May brought those numbers to the meeting, hoping for a little standing among her neighbors, and she made the mistake of showing them to Glenn Dorsey across the folding table in the church basement. He studied the sheet a long moment, and what he said was not unkind, but it was the old certainty reaching for the new fact and trying to make it small. "This is interesting," he said. "It is an anomaly, though. 4 acres of anomaly does not make a business, and you cannot scale it. The market does not pay for a curiosity." There was that word again, the engineer's word, scale, the assumption underneath every dismissal she had ever received, that a thing was worthless if you could not make a great deal of it. May folded the sheet and put it in her pocket. She did not argue. She had stopped arguing years before. She drove home and went up the hill in the dark and put her hand on Pip's head, and she thought, not for the first time, that the people who measured the world for a living had no instrument for the only thing she was making. Then came 2017, and the weather settled the argument, the way the weather always does in this country, impersonally and without appeal. It began as a dry spring, the creeks running low by the middle of May, the farm ponds dropping rings of cracked mud around their edges. The old men at the feed store said it would break by June. It did not break by June. It hardened instead into the worst drought those mountains had seen in 40 years. Week after rainless week of hard white sky, the dust standing in the road behind every truck. By July, the bottomland was cracked into plates a man could lift with his boot. Hal Pruitt's corn, all those efficient financed acres of it, was bred and planted and fertilized on the assumption of normal rain. And it had shallow roots, because deep, rich, well-watered soil never asks a plant to reach. The corn had been given everything its whole life, and so it had never learned to look for anything. When the rain stopped, it had nowhere to go. Field after field in the valley browned and curled, and rolled its leaves tight and died standing in the rows, a whole crop turning the color of paper in the space of 3 weeks. The county lost an estimated 9,000 acres of corn that summer. Hal lost 190 of them, nearly his entire crop, the leased ground and the home ground, both, with the loan payments on the new sprayer, and the widow's lease and the operating note, all coming due, exactly the same would have, in a year of plenty. He stood at his fence line one evening in August and watched 190 acres of dead corn rattle in a hot wind that carried no rain in it. And there is no part of me that finds that funny, because Hal Pruitt had done everything right by the book he had been handed, and the book had been wrong about the one thing that turned out to matter. Up on the hilltop, the tea bushes barely noticed. Let me tell you why. Because this is the payoff of the mechanism, and it is not luck. Those bushes had spent their whole lives on thin ground that never gave them easy water, and so over decades they had sent their roots down through the stony slope, deep, far deeper than any corn plant ever bothered to go, because the hilltop had trained them to find water where the valley plants had never needed to look. When the drought came, the corn in the rich bottoms died of a thirst it had never learned to survive, and the tea on the poor hilltop, rooted deep by a lifetime of mild hardship, simply kept growing. The very thinness that Glenn Dorsey had measured as the farm's weakness was, in the 1 year that tested everyone, its strength. The flavor that summer was the most concentrated May had ever tasted. The drought stress, driving the leaf chemistry, higher still, and she made the finest batch of her life in a season that ruined half the county. To the bank, that hilltop was 4 acres of marginal ground worth almost nothing per acre. To the drought, it was the only thing on the farm still alive. Word of a thing like that moves quietly at first, and then all at once. A chef in Asheville, who bought a little of May's tea for his restaurant, mentioned it to a distributor, and the distributor mentioned it to a woman named Ann Foss, who was a senior buyer for one of the oldest tea houses in the United States, and who had spent 30 years tasting teas from every growing region on Earth. Ann Foss did not believe American mountain tea could be any good. She had tasted dozens of attempts and found them all thin and grassy and amateur. She drove down from the city anyway, in the autumn of 2022, because the distributor would not stop talking, and she walked the hilltop in good boots that she did not mind getting dirty, and she asked May to brew her the current season's leaf, with no ceremony and no explanation. May brewed it the way her grandmother's notebook said, in the farmhouse kitchen, with Rose standing at the counter and Pip lying across the doorway. Gray around the muzzle now, but still there, still the one who climbed the hill. Glenn Dorsey was there too. May had invited him not to gloat, but because he had asked the first real question 9 years before, and she thought he had earned the answer. He came. He stood in the corner with his hat in his hands, an older man now, retired from the extension office, still curious, still unable to leave a contradiction alone. Ann Foss tasted the tea. She did it the way real judges do, slowly with a long silence first, holding the cup under her nose before she drank, then a small sip held on the tongue and breathed across. She set the cup down. She picked it up and tasted it again. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose had stopped drying the dish in her hands. And then Ann Foss asked the single question that decides these things. The question a person only asks when they have already made up their mind and are confirming a fact rather than forming an opinion. How much of this, she said, can you make in a year? May told her the truth, that the hilltop yielded a little under 200 pounds of finished tea in a good year, and that she would not plant another acre to make more, because more acres would mean worse ground and worse tea, and the whole point was the ground. Ann Foss nodded slowly, like a woman hearing the right answer to a question most people got wrong. Then she named her price. the price her house would pay per pound, for every pound May could make, wholesale, paid in advance for as long as the Hilltop produced. $480 a pound. Nobody in the kitchen moved. The number sat in the room with a weight, out of all proportion to the soft voice that had spoken it, because everyone there knew what it meant. It meant that the 4.5 acres Glen Dorsey had measured as the worst ground on the farm the Hilltop Rose had called too thin. For 40 years, the hobby plot, the anomaly, the curiosity that could not be scaled, was worth more per acre in a single season than the 200 rich bottomland acres had earned, in the best year Hal Pruitt ever had. It meant that May's grandmother had not been keeping a dead country alive in a row of plants. She had been growing the most valuable crop in the county and waiting 40 years for someone to have the instrument to measure it. The silence held. Pip shifted in the doorway. Rose put down the dish towel and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and the sound she made was not quite a word. Glen Dorsey was the one who broke it, and he broke it the way a good man does, by surrendering cleanly. He set his hat on the table. He looked at the cup, and then at the Hilltop through the kitchen window, and then at May. And he said the thing that cost him the most to say, which was simple and total. "I measured the wrong thing," he said. "For 30 years I measured the wrong thing." He did not make excuses. He asked, instead, if she would teach him what the readings on the leaf meant, because he wanted to understand it. Before he was too old to learn anything new, and a man who has spent his life certain and then asks to be taught at the end of it is not a defeated man. He is a converted one, and that is the better thing. Let me tell you what May did with the money, because this is where the story stops being about a number and becomes about what the number was for. She did not scale up. Ann Foss's house offered to finance an expansion, to lease her hillsides across 3 counties and put the family name on a national label and make her, in the language of the offer, the founder of an American tea region. May read the letter twice at the kitchen table and said no, because she understood at last the one thing every confident voice that had ever dismissed her had also failed to understand, which was that the value was in the limit. More acres meant worse ground, and worse ground meant ordinary tea. And ordinary tea was the very thing the world already had too much of. The Hilltop was worth $480 a pound, precisely, because there were only 200 pounds of it. To scale, it would have been to destroy it. And she had not spent 11 years learning the difference between the two kinds of knowledge, only to forget it the moment the money arrived. So she paid off the small remaining debt on the farm, a few $1,000s that had hung over the place for years, and she did 3 things her grandmother would have recognized. The first was the hardest and the best. She walked down the gravel to Hal Pruitt's place one cold morning, where Hal was parking the big sprayer in a line of equipment he had tagged for the auctioneer, selling off the beautiful, efficient machine to cover the loans the drought had broken him on. May did not come to buy anything. She came to tell him that the high stony slopes above his ruined bottoms, the steep acid ground he had always grazed and ignored, exactly as her family had once ignored their own hilltop, were close to perfect for tea, and that she would teach him everything in the notebook for nothing. Hal looked at her a long time, a proud man at the lowest point of his life, being offered a hand by the neighbor everyone had called a fool, and then he took off his cap and said all right. Within 3 years, Hal Pruitt was making a small, fine crop on land the bank had written off as worthless, paying his debts down a pound at a time, and he never grew corn again. The second thing was the notebook. She took the cracked black journal, the most valuable object on 400 acres, and she had the Chinese passages translated, and the whole thing copied and bound. And she began to teach the handful of neighbors who came up the gravel asking, the same neighbors who had stood in the church basement and called her tea a hobby and an anomaly. Within 5 years, there were 6 small growers in the county, each making fine tea on the worst ground they owned, none of them planting more than a few acres, all of them selling everything they could make. And the third thing was Rose. May sat her mother down at the heirloom table. The table her own grandfather had built from a walnut felled on the property, and she laid the first wholesale check in front of her. Rose looked at it a long time, at the number that was larger than any single payment the bottomland had ever produced. And then she said the second sentence that mattered in this whole story, quieter than the first and harder to say. "I should have trusted my mother," Rose said. May reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's hand, and told her it was all right, that nobody in the county had owned the instrument back then, that the readings simply had not existed yet. And the two of them sat there together while the light went down the hill, and the smell of the evening's withering leaf drifted down from the loft on the wind. Here is what I have come to believe, standing at the end of this story and looking back down the 11 years of it. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they do not measure the same things. There is the wide, confident, credentialed kind, the kind that reads a soil probe and a market report, and tells you the truth about volume and topsoil, and what the system will pay, and that kind of knowledge is real and useful, and was not wrong about a single number it cited. And there is the narrow, deep, patient kind, the kind that lives in one woman's nose, and one cracked notebook, and 40 years of watching a single hilltop, the kind that knows the thing the probe cannot reach, which is that the same thinness that starves the corn is what concentrates the leaf. That hardship in the right measure is not a flaw, but a forge. The first kind of knowledge measures what is easy to count. The second kind knows what is actually worth having. For 100 years, everyone who looked at that hilltop saw the worst ground on the farm, and they were looking at the most valuable thing the family owned. And the only difference between those 2 sentences is whether you know what the ground is for. Halpert grows tea on his high, stony acres now. 6 neighbors do. The notebook is copied and safe. Rose drinks her sir's tea every morning at the heirloom, and every dawn, on 4.5 acres of thin, sour, wind-scoured ground that no instrument could justify. An old gray dog still climbs the hill beside the woman who finally learned to read it. The best things, it turns out, grow where nothing else will.